Good evening and welcome to the special session of the Ferndale School Board. Tonight we have called a special meeting. We're going to be discussing our legislative priorities, the superintendent, board interaction, and then also discussing our board policies for future modification. And so first item on our agenda tonight is those legislative priorities. And for that, I'm going to turn things over to Nancy.
All right, thank you. As your ledge rep, I fed you a whole bunch of stuff to have to consider and all that. So thank you to those of you who filled in those position statements. What we were doing is deciding for WASDA what our board's top 10 positions are to talk about or to promote when we go to the general conference this coming November. So anyway, each board member received a list of all of the policies that were new or worked on during the General Assembly, which I attended a week or so ago. And then everybody would pick their top 10 and we can see if there's overlap. And once we come to consensus, we can tell WASDA what we want featured and highlighted and moved forward. So if everybody has their positions, if you could look at your positions or your top 10 things. I can't look at both at the same time. So I see that, let's see. I guess the way we can do this is look at all of the ones which have multiple X's by them and the ones where we already show agreement. So number 7 is amply funded staffing levels. Yes, sure. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. I've got, you know what, I can toggle back and forth. Okay, so let me.
Chris, is there any way to put them up on the? Cool. And just one thing, Nancy, and not just as a thought, I did look through, there are 7 of them that there are 3 votes for. There's 2 others that are 2 votes, which that gets us to essentially 9, depending on how you want to do it. But just, I was curious, and so I was counting.
Oh, very good. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, so I think it looks like the ones which have more than 1 vote would add up to the 10. And we don't have to go up to 10, but that's, the max. So I guess what I'll do is I will just read what the text is for each of them. Do people want to take the time to do that or not?
Sorry.
I think for transparency, we probably ought to. Okay, so number 2, academic rigor. Wait, this is terrible.
Hold on just a minute. Which is.
Oh yeah, a little bit too heavy on the reverb there.
Which one?
All right. So I will read the ones which we have multiple board members signing up for. So academic rigor and equity in public education. So in the positions, that is WASDA shall initiate and support or support legislation and funding for innovative and equitable solutions to provide additional opportunities to access rigorous coursework to prepare students for careers in college, including but not limited to transition classes, work-based learning, equivalency courses of study, and competency-based crediting. So we received multiple votes for that. The other thing that our board agreed on, amply funded staffing levels. That's a long one. WASDA shall initiate and or support legislation that provides for the full, ample, sustainable, and equitable based upon student need, funding of salaries, benefits, and pension programs for minimum appropriate staff levels for the following necessary functions for all districts: teaching and learning staff, building administration and support staff, central administration and operational support staff, and substitute staff needed to support student learning and continued daily operations. So that's the second one.
Nancy, if I can just step in, just for those that might be watching this recording at a later time, there is a link to all of these positions that explain all of them if you're looking at the list on board docs. And I love saying that it's on board docs. That's kind of my theme and mantra. But if anybody is wanting to know what all the WASDA positions are, they are listed there through that link.
Yeah, so maybe I don't need to read through the whole thing. If you're interested, you could just look at them there. I will read, however, the numbers so you can find that and the titles for them. Number 46, fiscal notes and unfunded mandates, which basically says legislators do not pass something that we have to do without funding it. The next one is full funding of basic education. The next one is insurance premiums. And that, I would actually like to read that one. I think that's, I'm really delighted to see that more than just me wanted that one. I think it could be a really good thing for us. Let me find that and read that. Sorry, it's taking a while to scroll. There, okay. WASDA shall initiate and or support legislation that requires the state to fully fund any increases in the cost of insurance premiums in excess of inflation, particularly those changes from those that result from changes to state law made by the state legislature. And insurance premiums went up significantly this year. Next one is no mid-school year budget cuts. And the next one is removing barriers to innovation in public schools. The next one is support for special education programs. And then transportation funding. So Kevin, does that add up to 9 that we have, or is that 10? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so did we get this one is, oh, we got that one. Okay, I don't know if we need to make a motion or not to approve the list that was just read. I'm not sure the procedure protocol for that.
I don't know that there is a specific, we could certainly make a motion, or given the fact we've got consensus by the survey, we could go with that. I think either way is is legitimate.
Okay. Yeah, I'd just like to know if everybody's on board with it all.
Everybody good with those top 9? Okay, then I think we've got it by consensus.
Okay. All right, there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you for providing all that information to us, Nancy, and for representing us in that role. Okay, so next on our agenda tonight is a look and review at policy BSR3, the authority of the superintendent. And Christy asked that this be put on the agenda so that we could have a discussion about that tonight. So we will go from there. Do you have specific questions that you wanted to, or?
This is just one we have not talked about as a board. I don't think since I've gotten here. It was previously here. And just given clarity over last meeting, I could use some clarity about the expectations, a review. A year ago, we had agreed to always go over the board social contract. And so I thought we might as well do that tonight. And then it was just a recommendation for you to take or leave. So that was it.
So everybody does have BSR3 in their packet that Chris provided. So you've got a hard copy there. Maybe I'll give everybody just a few moments just to read through that if you didn't have a chance to before the meeting, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Okay, so the floor is open. Peggy, you look like you're ready to speak.
I am. And first off, I would like to say, Christy, I apologize for any friction that I may have created in my interpretation of this policy. I asked Kevin about the SRO contract and interlocal agreement, right? Because as a board member, I felt, I mean, really honestly thought that interlocal agreements would have to be approved by the board before they were enacted. And because we are a governing body, we are the government, and that's our names on the agreement. So, you know, I was under the impression, this was my understanding, and perhaps it was wrong, that, you know, therefore we would need to approve it before it was enacted. Now, I asked Kevin about that, and he said, I said, does it have to be brought to us for approval first? And he said, technically, no. To me, this is still a gray area, because I feel like this is one of those places, like, you know, we should have certain bright lines where we expect stuff to come to us first, and you don't see it written there hard and fast. So it's just like loosey-goosey interpretation. And I think that's where we end up butting heads. And so, you know, I just want you to know that I'm looking at it from this angle. You're looking at it from a different angle. And so naturally, I think we end up at odds.
Yeah, thank you. And that's why I wanted to talk about this, because I think we haven't talked about this and we need clarity. Because if we're all coming interpreting the job, I see the job as you tell me what you want to do, which I had taken the fact that we had talked about the DRO since before I got here, community input, move forward with it as the go ahead from the board. So that didn't feel new to me. So I was caught off guard that this was all of a sudden we're talking two things, the DRO and the strategic plan. I don't know that I mean, I probably could communicate it more. I'm just not sure how. I've been reflecting a lot. Chris and I've been talking, Selena, I've been talking about how to communicate, but I just need clarity. I have made a commitment and this one got through that regardless if I need board approval or not, that I will do is the best I can to bring all contracts forward ahead of time. This one was one that got to me after it was already in place, which was fine because the board, my team had felt like the board had already given authority to have a DRO. Like it was a common, and we even said that night, that's something everybody wants. So there was no question on that. But I just need some clarity. And so once I have that clarity, that helps me. If there's something that I'm doing that the board doesn't approve ahead of time and it gets signed, I'm going to take full ownership on that. That shouldn't happen. I've talked to the team. I think we're doing a better job. Chris is really good about like, this has to go to the board. Now that we have an internal communication system, how everything goes, making sure the lawyers seeing every single contract. That was not the case. If you recall, the board asked for that. That is now happening. So there have been some really good movement. So I just thought this allows you all some time to talk about some clarity, and I'm always going to figure out the how. And so I felt like I had gotten permission from the board, hence why I moved forward.
I can absolutely see how you would have felt that because we were all in agreement. There's no question about it. In my opinion, I think maybe something like that is not so difficult to see. I mean, we had conversations around it. It was obvious to me in looking at the emails that came and all the stuff that you posted, and you are very good about keeping us informed. Okay. I will say you're very good about keeping us informed. More so than in the past, I think. It's just that there are certain things that I thought, we would see, that being the final contract, which when I say I felt like I wasn't informed, that's the piece that was missing. And so I want you to understand that's where I'm coming from. Same thing with the strategic plan. With the entry plan, I mean, you made allusions to the fact that the information gathered from that was going to be used to put together the strategic plan. And indeed, that's what you did. It's just that in came Tammy Campbell, did not know that she'd been hired as a consultant. This is all of a sudden, here's this person and she's directing these activities. And it's like, who is this person? What is she doing? And she's already been hired. We didn't see the scope of work or anything. And so I felt like, okay, this is where I felt like it kind of fell in the cracks. Again, as I said, you did provide a lot of information, no question about that. And I know you worked really hard on it, but
and so she was actually hired before I was.
Yeah,
so
I know
she
that.
was. So I don't know what happened. I feel a little bit like Nancy about what happened before, and so you're trying to catch up. Not that you don't know, just you. We have to try. When you're new, you have to figure it out. And so, what we were able to do with Dr. Campbell once I got here with a contract that was already in place is refine how we were going to use her, and it was facilitation only of that strategic plan. So.
Yeah. And just so you know, that plan was not brought to us for approval. We weren't included in that. I've looked high and low for the contract. You can't find it online. You can't find it on board docs. Scope of work, none of that was there. And I think it probably should have been brought to us, even though the contracts, look through the, what do you call it? The vouchers, to see what payments were made to her. And there's like 5,600 some here, then another 5,000. So obviously this was an ongoing process. She was being paid, but didn't, have anything to attach it to. And it's like, even though it's a small-ish dollar amount, I feel like the impact on the district, that because it's the strategic plan, which really dictates our priorities and everything else and how money will be spent going down the road. I felt like that was a very important thing. And so that's why I'm that's where I'm coming from.
I think one of the pieces that was really hit on during our discussion of coherent governance and policy governance, being real similar, is how the board worked with, here's what we want done. Here's what our goals are. Here's what we're hoping to achieve. And then it was the superintendent's responsibility to figure out the how are we going to get there? You know, we want students to achieve this level, and then that's the person's job. We want the district to go this way. And one of the things that kind of stuck with me in that training process was that if we tell the superintendent, this is what we want done, and then we tie his or her hands in, here's how you're going to do it, then it's really not fair to judge them on did they accomplish that goal. And that's part of where in the coherent governance model of evaluating the superintendent is not a once a year type thing. It's every time we do those monitoring reports, we're essentially evaluating them, and the superintendent's evaluation becomes a compilation of those, which if you haven't been through the process the other way, because before we had those reports, it was okay, it's June, we have to review the superintendent, and we were all sitting there going, well, I don't know, how did they do? What, and it became more of a what happened in the last 2 weeks, the last month type situation. So in that regard, it's been helpful. And again, it was something that was brought out and maybe emphasized. So I have that comfort level of looking at those things. And, as it talks about within some of the other policies, how we've delegated that authority to the superintendent to accomplish those things. So that's just a different perspective.
So if I may, part of my problem is policy 4320. If you read policy 4320, it basically says that proposals for these things need to be brought to us for approval, but it doesn't really indicate what exactly constitutes a proposal. Now, to me, when I think proposal, I think, you've got all the details there for us to look at and weigh, as opposed to, hey, we're thinking of doing this. So this is where the communication breaks down, I think, in terms of, how much detail do we need, and what timeliness does it need to come to us?
And again, if the board had not given the go-ahead, yes, move forward, that would have been a very different process. So there was a meeting. I remember even Melinda actually voiced she was not for it. She said, I do not agree with this, but I will move with the board. And so though it wasn't a formal vote, it was, yes, please get the DRO. So again, I felt like that was very clear on what my job was. Even public comment and the city council, that was the one thing I think I shared before I was even on contract. I got pulled into a meeting about it. So anyway, that was my interpretation.
Well, I would say that actually is a correct interpretation in terms of we all really were on board with it. I don't think there's anybody here that didn't want it. But as you pointed out, Melinda didn't want it, and she isn't the only person. I mean, there's other people in the community that probably don't want it either. And so then if we don't follow a really squeaky clean process, then does that leave an opening for somebody to come back and criticize it? And
that's why it took 3 years, because there was a very squeaky process. I was meeting with students and staff, community. It's why I brought it up often, waiting for feedback. I don't know that we moved as slow on many things as the DRO. So anyway, I did vet it. Everywhere I went, I would kind of ask. And I was mindful of it. It's not a position that all communities want. And so I wanted to be thoughtful about that.
Well, I'm just thinking to myself, I just want to bring forward the fact that the board is in a very precarious situation when it comes to this kind of thing, because we're all individuals, and because of policies that are in place, there's no collaboration. So, we have what you pretty well perceive as individual thoughts as to how things should go. And that makes it very difficult to function as a team and have collaboration amongst everybody. Everybody has their own opinion. So I just want to bring that forward and make people aware that the situation we're in is very, very difficult to function as a team and collaborate and come together. So this is why these types of things come up, is because there's no discussion that goes on between board members as to thoughts and, you know, what their future looks like as far as, you know, what's going on. So I got to give a lot of slack to these board members. And you know, I don't know how to explain it. I think it speaks for itself, but it's a difficult situation to function as a team when you don't have collaboration amongst the board. And I understand in the spirit of transparency that we're not able to come together and share thoughts and ideas. But I think in most team environments that I've ever been experienced, that is the thought process, is two heads are better than one. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where we're not able to do that. So I think that's where a lot of this confusion comes in, and misnomers and everything. So, you know, any apologies for, you know, misconceptions or anything like that. I think we all need to share the fact that we have to have patience and understanding where, you know, people are coming from, and, you know, cut each other some slack. So that's my thought.
I think that's very true. I mean, and that's part of the challenge, because if Christy has to wait for our approval for everything in running the district, because she can't call us each and ask and get a consensus vote, it has to be us together, you know, and look at how much trouble we had getting this study session together as far as trying to find some time. And I think that goes into one of my favorite lines of the social contract, which is always assuming positive intent, you know, because it is so easy to think, oh, well, they're doing this because of this or that or the other thing, when really, you know, I've heard you guys, I've worked with you guys, I've talked with you. All of us are here to do what's best for the kids. You know, we might have slightly different ideas of what is the best, but it comes down to it. And so I think you're right. We have to give each other a little slack and work together and try to figure it out how to accomplish that, and give Christy as much direction as we can. No different than the legislative policies that we just looked at. The reason they have those is so that when legislation happens, and those that have watched the process, it happens, you know, it crawls along real slow, and then all of a sudden, whoop, it ramps up. And that was so WASDA knew when they were lobbying for the school districts, okay, what is the consensus opinion? Doesn't mean everybody agrees with it. I don't know how. It sounds like Nancy's legislative conference was pretty quick and fast. I've been there when it's been very contentious, and you're kind of like, whoa, duck under the table. You know, so having, you know, a unanimous, everybody on the same page is great, but at the same time, having that healthy discussion and talking out those ideas is good too. So.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on that. Thank you so much for saying that, Steve, because I have felt that so many times. I just wish I could talk to each other. And I feel like as a board, we are at a marked disadvantage compared to admin, because admin constantly is talking to each other, knows exactly what everybody else thinks. And all we get to do is just show up in a public meeting and state what we're thinking without, you know, so I'm always wondering, I wonder what Steve thinks about this. I wonder what Antonio thinks about this. I have no idea. So yeah, our hands are tied. So what we need to do is to just make sure our policies are very reflective of what we want. So I would really hope that we spend time on having these conversations around policies that will make things go smoother, because that is what we want. And there's no doubt about the fact that all of us want what's best for kids. I mean, and I really think that presumed positive intent is true. You know, don't take offense if somebody says something that's counter to what you think, because it's just ideas, and we have to have a healthy exchange of ideas in order to move the needle. And that's what we're here to do. We are here to move the needle. We want these kids super successful. Otherwise, why are we here? So
may I say something? I really do think it would be better if we could have, like many boards have, which was just an additional session per month. I know that's asking a lot because, you know, it's extra time, but even a half an hour to just air some of the topics and just discuss, even if it's via Zoom, which would make life a lot easier, you know, and just to be able to, you know, these things are coming up on the next agenda. Can we have a discussion about this ahead of time? Maybe get more comfortable where we're going to land before we're, you know, at a meeting and having to make a decision, you know, without having had any conversation. I mean, I know that a lot of boards do have that sort of arrangement where, you know, they do have something of an advanced discussion and then the regular meeting. And I think that really helps with the communication.
I'll let you all have a conversation about that. I do want to point out one thing. I've been doing some research in the last week. I've worked under two types of boards, coherent governance and policy governance, which are very similar. Coherent governance tends to use more positive language, but you know, one thing we could do is talk to Rick Maloney again if we ever wanted to bring him back. I think, you know, he's been great. I try to add in the SMORE, he's keeping a blog. He might be someone that when we go to WASDA that we want to talk to him and sit down. He's, I know, more than happy to come. So something for the board to consider. But I've been trying to figure out, what do boards do who don't have these results policies or operational policies? And I just wanted to share a real story of another district who contacted me and that said, can you please explain to me how you share your results, like, you know, your academic outcomes? And I said, well, we do it in a board meeting. It happens in a monitoring report. They get a monitoring report 1 month, and then the next month they evaluate it and on. And they said, this person said, in 4 years, they've not been able to get to that because they have to talk about all policies. And then they have people come and do presentations. So I think, you know, they had no idea how to report to their board about the report you're going to get. Bobby and I've just been meeting on this, the report that's coming to you with the all the outcomes, the English, math, science, literacy. They don't have something like that. They don't have a report that talks about facilities every year. They don't have a system, so they know that every year there's a check-in, and any time that we're thinking about that and we're thinking about systems around it. And it's kind of hit or miss as to how the board, what they want to look at. It's not organized like that. So I think it's something for you to keep in mind. You are on a system where you actually have far more control and more information than a lot of boards have with this model. I think the point that Kevin was making earlier, because he spent time learning and getting trained in it, he has a sense of it. But I think that would be a recommendation for you as we go through these policies, because you write the policies and then we make recommendations for the indicators. So you tell us what you want us to focus on. And then I take it back to the team and we say, okay, these are going to be the indicators. And let me tell you, the communication one, it's not going to have 12 indicators anymore. We are changing that. But I think you're onto something. I think we just have to finite it and make it so it's your living document and not the board of the past, something they created. So I wanted to provide that insight because I had to go do my own learning in the past week, and Bobby and I have been talking about it.
So speaking of, we're not the board of the past. The assumption is that we have to stick with this thing that was created. And so I've been poking around. There's pros and cons to policy governance, coherence governance, and other things. Is it possible to keep the good parts and get rid of the things that aren't working? I mean, we can create whatever system we need that works for our district. And in looking at Arlington, for example, I shared that with Kevin. I see a very organized group that has reports that come to it, although they're in much broader categories. They have got basically 3 categories. There's the operations, there's academic results, and then there's I'm trying to remember what the third one was, but they're essentially facilities. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll have to go back and look. My apologies. But essentially it's what we've got, in my opinion, only much broader categories. So like 3 reports and not all these, things. And they don't have coherent governance, but they still manage to function in a very organized manner. And, their record keeping is
I
die
would
for.
recommend, my recommendation would be, after what I've learned, my team is also organized through this. They know what they're looking at. Bobby knows what data he's looking for. It's very clear. It's transparent throughout the organization, because you might be functioning and understand what you're asking for, but it's kind of like the lack of a strategic plan. It doesn't always trickle down that way. I'm able to shoot off these monitoring reports and say, this is what happened. It's also a communication tool to the community. So I'm not saying no. I mean, that's for you to decide. I would just bring in somebody and ask those questions as you're working through it, because I would hate for you to think, oh, I don't think this works anymore, get rid of it, and then have to start over. That's just, are you currently asking the questions you want? And that's why I'm excited we're going to go through this, because Bobby has been doing a lot of work. Like I said, he's been reading every single thing. He and I meet almost weekly right now. And we think you have too many reports. And so too many indicators. So I guess it'd be our recommendation to pare down, look through what you have. Are you actually measuring what you are needing to measure and wanting to measure? And then from there, we work at the indicators and get it so you're not looking at so many things, but what you're looking at does move the needle.
Would bringing in Rick Malone, would we be able to ask him questions on how to pick out the best things on that? Or if we were to bring him in for some sort of a board training, does that seem like it might be a valuable thing? I've never met him. Oh, did I meet him? Oh, I met him. Okay. Okay.
From my experience in working with Rick and working through the training and seeing what Bobby's been able to produce, I think we could probably actually do it just as well. I mean, I guess I'm not sure. I think Rick has got some good information on coherent governance, but I'm not sure if paring down reports to our district and what we're looking for is necessarily within his scope or his expertise. I may be wrong. I mean, that's just my opinion from what I've seen. And again, I've been impressed. Part of this, I guess I look at it from a little bit different perspective in the sense of going through the process with creating the indicators, which I'll be the first to admit we've got too many and some of them that don't make a whole lot of sense. But I also know that having some of those indicators had us having conversations about important things like CTE, the arts, things that in the years prior to the development of those, we never ever talked about. We were going through things and it led to some really good discussions that led to some of the places where we're at now, so I totally appreciate Peggy's like, hey, we can make this our own. And I fully feel we should, but having seen what we were before when it was a little more loosey-goosey, I don't want to throw out the child with the bathwater.
So I can certainly appreciate that, Kevin. I just thought, okay, is it possible to go back and find, because it is something that I actually tried to do, go back and research the history of it, right? Of your adoption of coherent governance and what the vision was at that point in time. What were you aiming for? What were your goals? What was this thing supposed to produce? That, and so if we can identify that, see how well it's actually doing in producing those things, and either, eliminate parts of it or tweak it or whatever, and just say, this is what works for us. This is what doesn't. Let's, just kind of steer the ship a little bit in a different direction. One thing I would like to say, and this is something that has frustrated me since the very beginning. is that when you're bound by this and you're supposed to just, reach a consensus and not have these discussions, because it feels like this stifles discussion. I do feel like, it does kind of put a damper on discussion. I don't feel like we're as open to discuss things. In doing that, it creates a perception of rubber stamping and just this consensus. We just all agree when you don't have those conversations. And I don't think that's a good public perception either. And I've heard that before. So I just want to make sure that, we are able to respectfully disagree about important things, that we actually are discussing those things and having civil discussions in public, so that people know that we are thinking about these things, we're actually acting on these things, and we're not just sitting on our hands. Because I think there's a perception out there among some people that that's what happens. They don't see what we are bound by and why we can't do these things. So
I'm just trying to understand, as far as, are you talking with the monitoring reports, or where are you talking as far as we're not having the discussion? Because I know, historically we have had some very robust conversations on some of those. Probably not as much lately. But I guess I'm just trying to clarify, because I agree. I mean, that was part of the process that I appreciated the most, when we had some robust conversations about some of those programs, again, ones that we hadn't talked about before, and we were bringing up and asking the administration questions about, well, why is this and why is this? And honestly, we were getting answers of, that's a good question, we need to look at that. And that, again, produced things that moved the needle.
yeah, and I very much appreciate that, because, the idea that you should have to come and be able to answer everybody, everybody's questions about this, that, and the other is crazy. I mean, there's a lot of work involved in running a district, obviously, and a lot of details. And so if you don't know absolutely everything about, a question that's been asked, it's much better to say, you know what, I don't know, I'll look it up, because honestly, the expectation that you should know everything about everything is ridiculous.
But that is the expectation of my job. My job is to know, if I don't know it, to know who does know it. And so asking questions live here and me saying, oh, I don't know, I get a lot of public feedback that does not cause trust in our organization. So, I may say, thank you, you asked that question earlier, I was unable to reach out to so-and-so, but sometimes it takes me time to say, who would I need to talk to figure this out? Or, Bobby can't just always pull up data right in the moment. So that's why I request, even if I can't answer it that night, if I know it ahead of time, we can start working on it. And I think if you have that question, 50 other people do, this is the time for me to answer that. And so if I have to wait a following month, it just erodes trust. And given that, when I got hired, trust between the district and the community wasn't as high. It's something we still work on, but that transparency piece is huge. It's why the bond oversight worked, because people were asking questions of the district we couldn't answer. So we went and found a group of people who met and wrestled with it and trained us in a live meeting that the public could watch. So I think that's why I always say, if I know ahead of time, it gives my staff time to find out. And they're really busy. Like today is a really good example of a day going really south. And so this would be a day would be really hard for me to answer a question on the spot, even if I knew it. So we need process time like anybody.
Well, from the standpoint of, a board member, I have to say, I honestly just appreciate you saying, you know what, I don't have that information, I'll get back to you with it. Because to me, I think that actually builds trust. So I disagree with you on that. I think that actually builds trust when you can have that kind of conversation. You're like, yeah, I'm comfortable with the fact that you will go look this up and get back to me about it.
And that's why the email works, because that's a conversation between you and I. But when it's recorded and live and the audience is out there, I mean, when I have literally, when I say I don't know an answer, the amount of emails I get of people questioning my authority, my ability to do the job is high. So I appreciate what you're saying, and you can do the email. That's why I try to include everyone, but that is not how everybody feels. And so I just try to be very mindful, and I will come here and say, you know what, we couldn't get that answer today, but on the spot, I can't just answer it.
But and the flip
Well,
side,
let me just
Oh.
say, I appreciate your honesty because, we don't know what goes on behind the scenes. And I certainly would give you all the grace in the world if you don't have the answers for me immediately. I mean, I'm fine with, I'll get back with you. So I do appreciate the honesty that there are people out there that are like that. And that's pretty unfair in my opinion, but that's just my opinion.
the other flip side, because in my, day job role, I kind of am in a similar position, and people do expect you to know the answers and know all those things. And agree, it's not always fair because, the brain can only hold so much. The other point that I would make about that is if we ask those questions ahead of time so that Christy can get the answers, find her team, have some time to research it, it helps us out because then she can answer with that information at the meeting so we can have those robust discussions because we've got the information we need rather than, okay, we're talking about it, you ask the question, she's got to go find the answer. And by the time we get to the next meeting, well, what was that question again? What were we talking about? And trying to get back into it. So that would just be my other added feedback of the more information the more prepared we can be for our meetings, the better it helps us to have those conversations.
Well, and I'm going to reflect back and consider the fact that there's many times when I sit in on this meeting and I hear you in particular say, well, yeah, back so many years ago, this is what happened. And so, the answers a lot of times may, fall within this board and their past experience. It isn't always on the administration so, I mean, that's something to take in consideration as I reflected earlier, that it's a real issue that we don't have any collaboration amongst us. And, I've said in the past that everything I should know, and that's not the case here. And it's unfortunate.
So another aspect of that is, and this is a problem I have, it's like, okay, well, two things. One is when you're communicating like that, there's always the risk, of serial communication, which I definitely want to avoid after the lovely situation. The other thing is that if I ask a question and you've answered it to my satisfaction, I'm like, I'm satisfied, and I don't bring it up at the meeting. It's like, this is the problem. It's like, then I'm happy. Somebody else is happy because they got an answer to their question. We've all got these, and so we got our questions answered, but the people out there don't, because we don't bother to go ahead and follow through and ask those questions in the meeting, because guess what? It's time consuming. And so I think the problem with that is we get satisfied, but the people who don't.
But they can't know everything, right? Like we can't share everything. We would have to move in here. And literally, I'm 3 years going 3 years in the job. I'm like learning something new every single day. But I think that's why I make sure the board knows. So I'll BCC the whole board if there's a question that I think, oh, I bet more than one person wonders about this. And so I'll BCC everyone, because who are they going to ask? They're going to ask a board member. Hey, have you ever talked about this? And you'll be like, actually, I do know the answer to that. So I do count on the board to answer questions when they're out in the community and people ask them. And I know that you come to me with questions like a community member asked this. I didn't know how to answer it. It's kind of like what I do to my staff. Somebody asked me this. I don't know how to answer it. What's the answer? So I just think, it's us putting it out there, being as transparent as possible. And, people who are interested in different things, I'll go back to the bond oversight. Those were a group of people who were really interested in facilities, and the conversations they had, I sat there and thought, what are they talking about? I don't know about HVACs. I don't understand the digital numbers, the this or that. I learned a lot, but I have great admiration and rest assured that somebody on our board and my staff can answer those questions, so I don't have to be the expert. So I think too, the thing about the policies, if we really want to move the needle, then we can't spend so much time in the weeds. That's like me. I do not spend time in the weeds of the classroom. I go in and I observe someone teaching, but I can't answer the questions like Kelly can about iReady, because I'm not going to benefit anybody if we all know a lot about iReady, but then I don't know about the other things. And so I think you're a governing board, you govern, you make sure that we're moving the needle. You say, hey, Christy, we're not on track. We got to do something different. Then I go wrestle with the people who are in the weeds of the work, and they are the ones who know how to do it. And Nancy and I both sat in the classroom for a long time. And if our principal came in, I don't know, I'm going to speak for you. You go ahead and argue. If they came in and always told me, nope, you shouldn't do it this way, I have a different opinion, I don't think that would have gone over so well with us, because we knew the kids. You give us the curriculum, and then we're going to make the instructional decisions on how to teach it, or maybe the order. We know they were governing us with the curriculum, but then we got to make those day-to-day decisions. How much time are we going to spend on something? Are we going to spend a little more here and a little more there? Are we going to meet one-on-one with this student? Are we going to be in small group with this student? So that's kind of what our relationship is, where you govern, you tell me what you want me to focus on, and then not me alone, but the whole organization. Then we go out and we figure out how, and that's how I spend most of my time, is thinking through the how. Do you agree with that as a teacher?
Yes, although something that came to mind was I remembered that my favorite principal, Tony Hardwar, he protected 90 minutes for literacy instruction every day, and it was hard and fast. And that did move the needle during his time there. True. True. Yeah.
I think the other thing is, and I wish Mark was here because he would attest to it, because I don't know how many times I've prefaced emails to him with, I'm going to ask you this at the meeting because I think the public needs to know, but I want to give you the time to get the answer. And I follow through with doing that. Most of the time when I'm asking a question, they've gotten it beforehand, because I would rather they have the time to get the answer, because certainly that's what I'd appreciate if people were asking me. And I think they appreciate that heads up as well, because again, it provides better information out the first time, because it's way easier to give good information the first time than to try and correct bad information. We all know how that goes.
Yeah, I like that idea of giving a heads up, knowing that this isn't going to answer me completely, because I think it's really important for this conversation to happen in public, so that there's transparency with how we come to the decisions that we do. So yeah, I like that. I will start doing that too. First line in my questions.
Yeah. And it does allow for that robust discussion, because if we all ask those questions, get the answers, that's great. The 5 of us, or 6, however many you want to count, have the information. But the people sitting out in those seats, then they think, well, they're not even talking about it. They're just like ka-chink, ka-chink. And so that's why, having that information, but asking those questions, because we've got good questions. We've got 5 great minds here, and many more, but in reference to the board, so we're asking good questions, but again, giving the heads up, because, how many of us would like to be put on the spot with a question, with everybody watching you, and you're trying to make sure you don't give them a good sound bite for the newspaper that makes you sound really interesting. So it just definitely works better that way.
I have a question that's come to mind. On consent agendas, they're supposed to be just for things that are, routine business. So how do we make sure that we have a policy in place or something to direct what doesn't go on a consent agenda, like something that would be brand new that would cause a change in the district? For example, 3211 or the DRO contract, that sort of thing, which causes a change, which to me seems like something that needs to be discussed and not just gone through.
So the DRO was discussed and like
Okay.
everything in there.
Yeah.
So that's why it was there. If you remember, and I think you were already on the board, when the new policies that are going to have major change are brand new, they go on for you to get, but then the next month they're part of board action. That's why. If it's a policy that is like, I'm thinking of the health, there was a health policy. The numbers aren't coming to me tonight. Oh, they never come. But the policy where it was just updating it a couple lines with the law, then that went on consent agenda. It was just something, it was so minor that it wasn't that big a deal. So what Evelyn does is she emails us and she says, this one's pretty major. Chris looks at them like it's kind of like what you do with the vouchers and stuff. Several people look at them before. If it's taking several meetings to get a policy up to date, then we're not going to put that on the consent agenda. You'll receive it on the consent agenda because you're just getting it the first month. But then the next month it'll go somewhere where you can have the conversation. So travel, that's, it's pretty routine. Who's going to take a leave, retirement, those things are just very routine. Chris, what else is on there that you can think of that we would pull off ahead of time? Oh yeah, some of the renewals, if it's not a new contract, but it's one you need to sign, but we've talked about it in the past. And again, that's why you can pull something off to talk about it. It doesn't mean you can't vote on it in the consent agenda. But if someone's like, you know what, this doesn't feel there, that's the authority of each board member to make that choice. And it is something that when we plan the agenda, for those of you who've been to it, we'll say, where should this go if we really aren't sure? That will be something Chris and I'll be like, we don't know where you want this. And so let's bring it to that agenda planning meeting. So those things are vetted ahead of time if they're not routine things. Can you think of anything else?
And the other aspect with anything that's on the consent agenda doesn't necessarily need to be pulled off to discuss it. You can discuss anything that's on there. It is only needs to be pulled off if we need to do a separate vote. And that, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that can even be, that doesn't necessarily have to be done at the beginning of the meeting. I think we can do that even if it comes up that we have discussion on it and go, okay, I'm not sure I want to vote on this with the rest of this stuff. I think we can pull it off at that time too. Yeah, I think that's okay. But like I said, I don't know for certain. So good. Any other comments? Good discussion. I mean, this is what we sometimes lack with as Steve says, trying to collaborate by ourselves.
Would we benefit from, well, if I think we would, but benefit from some clarity by providing definitions, like what is the definition of routine? Just having that, spelled out. Routine means this. Here's examples of routine. Here's examples of not routine.
I don't know, just I can look at every agenda. I could throw it in ChatGPT and say, pull out all the things that are routine and pull out the ones that aren't. I mean, there's some pretty standard things that are in consent agenda that I don't even think twice about. And if people are, which you all do your homework ahead of time, if there's something that doesn't belong there, that's why it's at the beginning of the meeting, you can pull that off. So it would be hard. I would hate for you to get so locked in to rules that it doesn't allow some flexibility as things develop. So, I mean, that's just, you get to decide, but that would be my, yeah.
Okay.
And that was one of the cautions when we did our training as far as with coherent governance. If you make it too tight, then the flexibility to move and deal with the situation becomes a lot harder to address. As I am thinking back and, this is just off the top of my head, looking at the consent agendas, looking at those things, and given the ability to, okay, if we see something that we're like, okay, I disagree with their judgment that that's routine, so I want to pull it off. We've got that option. I guess I worry that making too many rules makes it that much harder and really locks us into a box that makes the flow and the ability to wiggle with the situation much harder.
So one thing you have pointed out is that I pull things off the consent agenda all the time. And that's kind of an awkward place to be because, I feel like being kind of a mixer, like I'm stirring up trouble, which I really don't want. But for example, I see something on there like a contract that I think, no, I don't think that's, there's some things in there that I really don't like about that contract. So, I'm going to request to pull it off. And it's awkward from the other standpoint. If it's like if everything's on there and you have to pull it off and, oh, here she goes again, you've got this, I can give an example of like something that was routine was the contract with the Opportunity Council for the lease of North Bellingham, space at North Bellingham. There was a part in there that said that they would not be responsible for any damages, either intentional or unintentional. And I thought, why would you put that in there? So pull it off because I think that's not good, right? But then you don't want to be saying that in front of everybody, but you don't have any other opportunities because the contract's already been enacted, but you don't want to vote yes on it because you don't think it's a good contract. So what's this person supposed to do in a situation like that, where your conscience says, I don't like this. I don't want to say yes to this. But, if you pull it off, then you're having to explain how would you handle that?
I think that goes back, that's your job as a board member. And that goes back to what Steve said. You can't do that outside of it. You have to pull it off. You yourself might have an opinion on it, but that doesn't represent the board. And so that's just the job of an individual board member, is to bring that forward, have that robust conversation, vote on it how you believe you need to vote on it. And then once the decision's made, that's it. That's the decision of the board. I mean, that's what you get to do here.
Well, I think the avenue of that is, or the other piece of that is asking that question ahead of time to see, okay, is there something I'm missing within this contract? Maybe in another section that's covered. I know I've asked Mark about some contracts at various times throughout the years, when I'm like, okay, hold on, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then he said, well, yeah, but if you look back at this section or whatever, and there are times when he said, no, you're right. That's, and then we've had that conversation. So I think, and again, that goes back to the conversation that we were having before. Then when that comes up and, you have scrutinized that contract, right before the meeting and it's fresh in your mind, but maybe if it's Mark or Christy, whoever has been doing it that hasn't, they're having to scramble trying to, for lack of a better word, not look stupid as they're trying to get up to speed to where you're at, So asking those questions is not a bad thing. That's why we are here. That's what we're supposed to be doing. But giving people a heads up so they can give us a good answer is I think the take home message of it, and maybe to that end, if we decide as a board, okay, we want all contracts, to be separate. There might be a lot of contracts one month and on certain months to be approving, to go through them each individually. And some of them may be any discussion. Okay, let's vote. Some maybe there's lots of discussion. I mean, that is a decision we can make as a board too.
Well,
If I can just step in for a second. No worries. What you're saying, Kevin, is exactly right. For the consent agenda, because, you have some forethought and some opportunity. I just want to make a point that there are times when some of the other discussions we have, listening to other board members brings up conversation that you perhaps might not have thought of. And so unfortunately, that's where sometimes questions come in that, you weren't prepared to ask beforehand. And so in all fairness, and I apologize to the administration that, there are going to be times when questions are going to come up that you had no, prior knowledge that they were coming. And so it's just, a fact of life in the situation we're in. So I just wanted to bring that forward.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think that to some degree reinforces there's going to be plenty of those questions that do come up that are going to put people on the spot, that the more we can ask ahead of time to let them be prepared, or to know that there's, okay, hey, there's some questions about this, that's better. But you're absolutely right. There are going to be those questions that it's like, oh, this just came to me. And yeah, it is, but it's important.
I think that's different for me. That feels different for me because it's very visually like, oh gosh, that's causing me to think, which causes me to think. Like the discussions you all have, we're all sitting back here. What's happening is they're all taking notes. Chris is taking notes. The following Tuesday after every board meeting, we sit and we rehash the board meeting. What came up? What were some things we need to consider? Like this is a work session for the team. That's why Bobby's here tonight, not because I think that he's going to probably be giving a ton of data, but your discussion tonight informs how he works. So that doesn't feel like a gotcha. But when somebody's thought about their question way in advance and they bring it and they knew about it prior to the meeting and then they wait to ask it publicly, that's a very different thing. If you knew it ahead of time, just ask it. Even if it's an email like, hey, this just came to me. It's amazing how much that just helps us say, because I could say, Steve, you know what? You asked me that earlier today. I haven't had time to follow up on that, but I'm going to check in with, A, B, and C. So then people know that there's somebody in the district who's in charge of it. There's somebody that we can get that answer, and I'll follow up in an email. Does that make sense?
Yep. Totally. And, I would never blindside anybody. That's not my nature, but I'm just bringing it forward that, there are situations where, things pop in your head and, you might shoot from the hip and, things trigger. And so I'm just cautioning that, there are instances where that can happen.
Exactly. And that's where, if we've got that track record of asking the other ones ahead, it's a lot easier to assume that positive intent with those questions too. Well, good discussion, guys.
I just have one last little question on this. It's the last sentence in the authority of the superintendent. It does say, the board will respect and support any reasonable interpretation of its policies by the superintendent. And I'm good with that. But then this part, I just have a question about. Even though superintendent decisions may not be the decisions the board or its members may have made. So how does that square? Because if the superintendent has made a reasonable interpretation of something, and this is for absolutely no specific thing whatsoever. I'm just thinking that sounds like an oxymoron. If they interpreted what the board wanted, why wouldn't the board have made a similar decision?
How I've read
get
that one is you're going to tell me, and the results are the operational expectations that you want something done. I can't even think of anything right now. You want me to do something. And then I meet with the team and I think these are how you do it. I'm going to have information that the board may not have in my interpretation, right? Like I have data on maybe how many students who are McKinney-Vento or free and reduced lunch or the makeup of a class or whatever it is, how we're interpreting it. It would be hard pressed for me to do something that I know the board is not supportive of without having a public conversation about that first. Like, board, I am going to make this decision. I'm going to make this. I even do it now. Like, I would like for you to consider doing this, or I would like to make this recommendation. Ultimately, the decision is yours. I think that would have to be a very contentious situation where somebody's just, I can't even think of a situation where I've even seen that happen. But I may go against what an individual board member wants. I can't imagine a superintendent going against a whole board. But if I'm making a decision that I know one board member is not going to like this, that doesn't mean I'm gonna take the advice of that board member, but I may have to say, you know what, though, I think this is what's really good for the whole organization. And I feel like the board in its entirety agrees, but an individual board member may not agree. That works for me, but I don't totally, I don't know. Have you ever seen anything like that where they've gone totally against a board?
Not here.
I mean, that would be hard. That would be,
Well-
that wouldn't feel good to me because our job is to work together.
Yeah.
And if the board is not in line with me, the whole organization feels it. If we're not one team, the whole organization pays the price. If there's appears to be conflict, it causes distrust in the community. So we may not always agree, but we have to agree to not agree. We have to agree to work together and support one another, assume positive intent. But I think we have to be unified. So that's just my thinking.
The one place off the top of my head that, and I have seen other boards that have had issues. There was one board early in my career that, okay, I'll be honest, you would sometimes watch their meetings, see if the police got called in. And literally sometimes they did, and not for the audience, it was for the board members. That was kind of a sad statement of where their board was. But I guess I look at that in the example that you guys were just talking about. You were talking about Mr. Hargwar having that dedicated time for literacy, but you may not have done it the way the teacher down the hall did it, but you had the same goal, but you made different decisions in the way that it was being done. And so I guess that's what I look at that as being. You're heading for the same goal. You're respecting that 90 minutes of literacy time, but you're carrying it out, how you're educating, how you're doing it in just a little bit different way. But if there are, again, going back to that, like Christy says, if there are major discrepancies, the board is saying you should be over here and the superintendent's over here, then there's bigger problems than how things are running.
Yeah. Thankfully, that's not where we.
No, because that's going to move the needle, but it's not going to move it the way we want it to go. It does. There's lots of data to that effect. So other comments. I mean, I think, the take home message or the big part that I've seen with this is, one, the communication. It also shows the importance as we go through our policies to make sure that we are really kind of with our policies and indicators. And I think this is what we've seen as we've went through those. We need those indicators to be good indicators and the correct indicators. And I really, truly do feel like having Bobby involved in that conversation where we can say, okay, this is what data we have or what we're looking for. Can you provide data? And that is going to be helpful. No pressure.
So Kevin, can I ask a question?
Sure.
As far as expectations of things that, the information that should come to the board or things that be presented in a certain format, do we need to spell it out clearly, what we're looking for in the stuff that's brought to us? I can give an example with the purchase of the American Legion building. Okay, so there was a note there that, we'd seen like the appraisal and some other stuff, which hadn't. And then I felt really awkward. I didn't even realize. I'm thinking, oh, we were presented with this, but we weren't. But now am I, that was me. Like, I felt like I personally, as a board member, had kind of dropped the ball on not asking for those things. But then it said we'd been given them, information about the transaction, right? And so it's like, documentation on things like that. Is there a standard that, if there's like, say, for example, a real estate transaction, the board will be given this, like the settlement agreement and the appraisal and the, whatever. Just, is there a certain, because I feel like this is a clarity issue yet again. It's like, if we can expect that certain things would be brought to us if we're asked to make decisions of this nature, then that just makes everybody's job easier because they know what we need information wise in order to do what we're supposed to be doing. Did that make sense at all?
I think to a certain extent, I mean, I think part of it is, um, in my mind, it's, okay, if we got a real estate situation, but those don't come up that often.
Yeah.
If we have a standard amount of information, one thing I do like, and I apologize, my day sort of went a little crazy, not as bad as the high schools, but, you were showing me, or you made me aware of that, Arlington agenda. And I definitely want to talk to Christy and Chris about that, because I like the way it had some standard information, budget implications and things. And I think that would be a real asset to the board, to the organization, to transparency. And I think that's something that would help, I think, have some more standard information of what you're looking for. And I think that would be a good place to go, because I think, again, it really provides for some transparency. And I think at some point we can get the information. It'd be interesting to talk to the Arlington board. Okay, how do you put that all together? Because it doesn't just happen. And then maybe have a conversation with the board. Is that, first of all, getting Chris and Christy involved, is that something that we can do? And if so, is that something the board would like? Again, don't want to hit them cold turkey with it, because they're going, what are they talking about? But I think that kind of thing on there, and part of the original goals that sort of, for, not to blame everything on it, but COVID really threw a wrench in things. Part of the goal for coherent governance and the agenda and the meetings was to tie everything back to the strategic goals, or the strategic plan, and the various different priorities of the board. And that sort of kind of got waylaid in the process. But again, that agenda goes back and does it really well. It hit what policies every action and thing was supporting.
I'm actually kind of glad you brought COVID up, because what is like the planning for things like that going forward in the future? Because I'm sure you guys must be talking about this. We got hit with it once, it could happen again. Is there a coordinated response as a result of, hey, looking back, we shouldn't have done this. This was better. I'm just curious, because I don't hear the legislature talking about addressing problems with, if something like this were to ever happen again, or, any number of other awful situations. Like, in fact, Christy, I think I remember asking this question during your interview process when you were hired, that, this business of, how about if we anticipate scenarios and have a plan in place before they happen, kind of thing.
So I was the lead, one of two leads, in my other district to reopen schools. It's not about what you're going to do. It's about having a good system of how you're going to do it. It's about having relationships with organizations who have to be involved for those things up front. I invest a lot of time. Today was a great example. We had an amazing response, and I want to give a shout out to our first responders. I want to give a shout out to my team. I want to give a shout out to the high school team, to transportation, to our middle schools, to maintenance and facilities. Everybody was ready to go because we had good systems and we have good relationships. Within minutes, that school was surrounded. It was blocked off. Public Works was working. The sheriff's department is working. The Ferndale Police Department is working. The city of Bellingham, their communications person came up and was sitting side by side with Selena in my office for most of the day. Like, we had a system in place to respond. You cannot prepare for the crisis without good systems. And so that's the key. So yes, are we ready? Yes, we are ready because we've got the relationships in place. We have the trust in place. We know who the people are at the table. Hence having a DRO, that's another bonus. That's why we're doing county-wide I Love You Guys training. Right now, Chris Cochran and I just met with the ESD because we're seeing an influx of gang activity Well, I'm not going to try to figure that out by myself because that we're one entity. So we're working on organizing a county-wide response of coming together. What do you look for with gangs? What should you know? How do we train? And we're going to decide that as a collective. So that's how you prepare. So yes, we're always preparing, plan for the worst, hope for the best. That's the motto. We do it every single day because we never know what's going to happen. Might be a pandemic. It might be a threat to a school. So yes, all the time. It's good systems, good relationships.
Way to find the silver lining in today's incident.
Well, and I think that's very true just because when we did the pandemic, it was those connections, those relationships, with COVID, because part of it you couldn't totally plan because you were being told from the top down, this is what you're going to do. But because of the relationships that we had here, what I experienced as the board part of it was that allowed us to at least put a little bit of our own personalized spin and to make it fit a little bit better for our community. Was it perfect? No, by no means. But if we didn't have those relationships and those things in place, it would have been a lot uglier. Okay, well, if I may, I think I'm going to move us ahead. This has been great discussion. And I think that really helps us to function better because we understand each other and where we're coming from. And it does help us to have, my favorite talking point of positive intent. Because when you know where somebody's coming from, when you know that their ultimate goal is to move that needle for kids, it makes it easier to go, okay, not sure exactly how they're thinking this, but I know that that's what their ultimate goal is. Are there any particulars? I want to leave us enough time because part of it was kind of getting some information with policies, and I don't want Bobby to have sat here the whole night just to listen to us talk about our relationship with the superintendent and with each other. But are there any points, and I think we've kind of alluded to things within the social contract, maybe some points higher than others, but anything in particular there that people would like to address at this point before we move on to talking about some of the policies?
I think one of my first meetings here was where we were looking at the social contract. And I remember a couple of things standing out to me and saying something which probably wasn't taken very well. Like some of them seemed like something would be said by a second grade teacher. I think it was listening with our eyes and hearts, as well as our brains and ears, and encouraging one another's hearts. I don't know. I just felt like, could somebody tell me what specifically you mean by that? I think it's just adding positivity into the whole social contract. I mean, I don't take offense to that at all. Okay. Carry on, Christy.
Just keep on making that relationship with the local law enforcement. Where
Okay, so the second
group?
second section, last bullet.
Okay, there it is.
That and then
Sure.
yeah.
And I think a lot of that came, in fact, I can say with a fair bit of confidence that came from the point of moving beyond just looking at test scores, just looking at that hardcore data that there, that the person who brought that forth was wanting to look at the whole child, the whole student, as opposed to just being this rigid piece of, here are the facts. And I guess I look at that from my perspective. I am one of those, just the facts, Jack, give it to me straight. I get told or critiqued occasionally because I sometimes don't have enough emotion in or don't portray enough of that. It's all just black and white. And so I think that was what was trying to be put in there by the person who promoted it.
Could could it be reworded so that it isn't quite as mushy gushy? I mean, yeah, well, sorry, but
No.
what Nancy said is true. It just doesn't say what it, I mean, it's like, get to the point, what are you trying to say here?
Sure.
Just reword it, say it in a
Yeah.
straightforward manner that, so there's no having to, I think a lot of times what happens is the different people's interpretations
Mhm.
get in there, and then
Yeah.
somebody sees it one way, so if you don't have the concise language, then that's where you run into differences of opinion on things as
Sure.
well.
Sure.
So in other
Yeah.
words, can it be reworded?
And it can be reworded because this is the board's document. This isn't anybody else's. It isn't, it isn't mine. It isn't yours. It isn't Nancy's. It isn't Steve's. It's ours. And so we can definitely, if there are things that need to be changed or we want to change or we feel, that is certainly within our prerogative. Yeah. So.
If it were up to me, I'd take the mushy stuff out because I think the rest of it is plenty.
As far as you would just take that line out of there?
Yeah, that one, and encouraging one another's hearts. I think just speaking respectfully to each other and making our points and having our conversations. I think that just personally, you're that kind of person that does that, or you're not. I mean, people have their own personality styles. I always try to be encouraging when I'm talking, but it doesn't always come out that way. But I don't know. To me, those just seem like fluff.
As compared, as compared to the other statements, which tend to be a little more higher level, I guess, in my mind. I would agree. I wouldn't have a problem doing that.
In that, if I may, in the book, Great on Their Behalf, the one which talks about fully functioning boards that do great things for their students.
Mhm.
It says, why do school boards exist? What is the purpose of school boards? And not school boards. It's the whole system, school system. And the school systems exist to improve student outcomes. That's it. It's not adult inputs. It's student outcomes. And, we can do all the adult inputs we can to achieve those goals, but it's the student outcomes that really needs to be, prioritized. The priority.
Mhm. Okay.
So this being a special meeting, we wouldn't be taking any, if we wanted to vote to strike that we would have to wait until the regular board meeting to do that.
Yeah, we could, since we haven't announced or put anything as taking action,
Yeah.
but
that's
we
what I
can go, okay, we want to redo we want to bring this up, after
Yeah,
having
the next
conversation at our study session, we can bring it up at the meeting and make those changes. Yeah. Any other points on there that anyone thinks?
Well, I do have a question about, because this one kind of is like, okay, is this taking us outside of where we're supposed to be as a board? Okay. Where it says, I lost it, just a minute. The thoroughly exploring all options, trying to look at as many solutions as possible for every problem before we decide on one. If the problems are not ours to solve, if that's, an administrative function to solve those problems and not bring a bunch of options to us, if that's the case, then does that belong in our?
I think it does, in the sense that we have to recognize that that is for those problems that are in our lane, for the problems that we have to focus on, the things that we have to solve, then looking at as many solutions. But when it comes to, things that
Yeah.
we've delegated to Christy to solve, we don't need to look at every solution. She needs to look at every solution and tell us how she's going to do it.
Okay, so that was kind of my question, because if you look at, again, policy 4320, where it says they'll bring proposals, I mean, I guess I would interpret that to mean, they've identified a problem and they present us with our options and they ask which one, we think as a board, you want us to give you the go ahead on it. I don't know. I'm just wondering if there's overlap there.
And you said 4320, right?
Yeah, 4320.
Is that the
Because it's
policy?
Yeah.
So that's that's how we work with private schools. So we have obligations to private schools.
Was it
So that
40?
43 20 is cooperative programs with other districts. So like if we do Assumption or I wonder if Discovery's in there, Chris, would it be under there? Yeah, and we have certain obligations to students who attend private schools. So that's what this policy is really about. Oh yeah, childcare is if we have to provide something there.
Yeah.
If a family, an IEP team says, no, our child's not gonna leave childcare, you need to provide the services there. That's what this one's about.
Okay, so I guess in reading through it, it says whenever it appears to be economic, administrative, and educational advantage of the district to participate in a cooperative program. What I meant by that is if there's more than one program that you might be considering, then would you, it's just a, because oftentimes there's more than one program, like say we've got several programs going with high school kids for picking up college credit, for example.
Yeah. So on this particular one, we don't determine it. The family does.
Okay.
So it's where the family chooses to enroll. Then by them enrolling there, if they're a Ferndale school district, then we are bound to that partnership because we legally have to provide opportunities or services.
Yeah. I don't want to take this off in the weeds, but if you've got a chance to sit down and talk about 4320 at some point, I would like to do that.
This would be a good one for you to work with Kelly and Trina on. So,
Okay.
because they're the ones who have to go out, we have to set aside some budget resources. We may have to send staff there. So they have to think through all of that. So that would be a good one to talk to them about.
Okay. Thanks.
I'll let them know. Chris, will you make note of that?
I'm wondering with the suggestion and that Nancy made, if in that last group of bullet points, given that we're looking at eliminating the listening with our eyes and hearts, if we should be eliminating, encouraging one another's hearts as well to be consistent. Not that okay. I was just kind of looking through.
So I think that from our discussion today, we figured out how to do the no surprises
Mm-hmm.
questions in advance so everybody's ready.
Yep. So why don't we do this? If if everybody, because again, I think we've covered a lot of these things in our conversation. If there are other changes that people would like to suggest to this, if they could email them to Chris and or I, so it's just a one-way thing, and then we can compile those changes and then we can put them forth at our board meeting when we take action. Regarding the social contract. Because that way then, again, I'm not trying, I don't want to limit the discussion, but at the same time, I want to get through all the stuff we have and have time, as robust as our discussion was on the first part. And again, that was great. I think it was very helpful. I felt really good about it. But I think it will be good to talk about these other things too, so we can give Christy and her team some direction so they can get stuff together for us as we continue to work on those, so that the ultimate goal being that they can write monitoring reports to indicators that make more sense, so that we don't go, oh, this is like, why are we doing this still? So, do you want to?
Yeah, so I may tap into Bobby here a little bit, but so what you have in your packet is all of the reports. The recommendation would be, I'm gonna grab this. I mean, all the policies. You don't have all the reports, all the policies. So what you also have is the annual work plan. And part of that is there are some decisions that need to be made just, you know, when certain things will happen. So what Bobby, I've asked Bobby to go through every single one and say, you know, while that's a really nice conversation, without data or a way to really measure it, we either need to invest, if it really matters to the board, we need to either really invest in figuring out how to measure it, design measurements, or is it nice to have, or is it a must have to move the needle, if that makes sense?
I am so glad you opened up this conversation.
Okay, good, because we think about this a lot. And Bobby and I sometimes look at a report or a policy and we go, huh, like, is that really, was it just something somebody was interested in maybe, and less about really doing your job as a board? Because what the policy should do is lift you high enough that you can really manage every part of the district without feeling like you're having to look at every part all the time. So touch points. The other piece too is, as Bobby's looking at, like, even though you're going to get the report in October about the state data, we think about it all the time. So is there, you know, some way that we're reporting at another time in the year? Was it University Place you looked at, and they only actually have 3 results? Oh, here, let me give you a mic.
Yeah, I can take a look. I think that University Place had 3 results policies and about 8. I'm going to try to look it up. Like 8 operational expectations. They had them worded differently.
But you can see here, so their policy governance were coherent governance, but what you can see is they've created a system where all the reports can be looked at every year. It's not this biannual. Every report is every single year. But what we want to do is create data systems that we are using to monitor growth and progress all year, not just when the monitoring report is happening. So if you remember last year, Bobby and I brought forward maximum representation. And then he created that spreadsheet that said, here are all the programs, and this is how we're monitoring it. So at any point I can say, hey, Bobby, I need to know this particular group of students, how are they doing in iReady data? In fact, we just had to fill out a survey for a grant that we have where, because of his spreadsheet, it didn't take any time because he's constantly updating that report. So a board member could say, hey, I'm curious about our math scores come March. We can get that to you without it being a big monitoring report. So the other part that Bobby has been looking at is just the frequency currently. So he's doing lots of work. We don't necessarily have that tonight because we wanted to hear what you were wanting, what your hopes were for this conversation. But I think one thing for us to keep in mind is while you write the policy, the executive team writes the indicators. So we're really listening to you. What is it you're wanting to really measure? What is you're wanting to really see? So for example, you're wanting to see growth in the academic standards. I'm just making something up. So then we're going to talk about, well, what are those academic standards? Right now, we have a results policy for everything. Everything. And if you remember when I first got here, it was a separate report for everything. And then somebody said, what if we actually did one report and you put it together? But to, you know, like if you want us to report on the arts and you want us to report on CTE and all of those things, well, there aren't state assessments that go with it. So we have to create assessments. So how do you want us to measure it? Do you want us to be looking at the increased number of students taking those courses? Right now, Bobby and I are looking at a database that actually will tell us where students are in 5 years post-graduation. And there's someone who keeps that data. And so we can buy into this data warehouse that we can say all Ferndale school districts 5 years from now. So even though we won't necessarily, it'll take some time to build it out, but so those are the kinds of things based on the things you talk about that we start to look at about how does that fit in. That currently doesn't really fit into any of the policies. So anyway, so our hope is that we're going to go slow to go fast, and that we're going to start looking at these. And probably our recommendation would be, given that we have OE5 and OE6, OE3, OE12, R4, and Bobby had a recommendation for that one to consolidate it, and OE10 left to talk about this year. Do we start with those so we can actually make changes this year on those, and then we'll start to tackle the other ones? Because it doesn't seem the most effective to change something that you're not going to talk about again until next September. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that. What before I stop talking, anything you would add?
I'm excited to hear what you guys talk about.
So when we're talking about data systems right now, we're just talking about results monitoring and not operational expectations. Both. Okay. So, I mean, I think of those as two separate things, and
there should be data for both.
Okay.
So like facilities, that has risen up as a board, a board priority. So what did we have to do? We had to go out and think about how are we going to measure it? Well, we're going to measure it because right now we don't have a preventative maintenance cycle in place. Once we get that preventative maintenance cycle in place, which this year you're going to hear updates on that, then we can start to say, okay, how often is it working? What's falling outside of it? So then that team, the facilities and maintenance team, is thinking about what's the data they're keeping to make sure that they're, that it's working. Because any system we build, we should be evaluating, is it working? How do we know? So those kinds of things. So we do have data for everything. It's just, or we can make data for everything. It's just, what data do you really want to see?
I'm very curious how you would group them. You mentioned a couple of things that you thought could consolidate. Can I hear some of those ideas?
Yeah, I can tell you what I was thinking. Some of the things were like just trying to consolidate to make fewer reports that might be talking about some of the same stuff. So like for results, one question would be, could we make the board policies for results aligned to our strategic plan? So could we have one that's early, like we have early childhood readiness? Could we turn that into early learning? I mean, and have it focus on the same goals that we're working on in the strategic plan. Career readiness might be future ready. And that might be some place that we could tie into post-graduation data. Did you have a question?
No, the concept of tying this into the strategic plan is just exactly where we ought to be going with this.
Yeah, then hopefully we're not repeating work, or the work that we create we can use in multiple places. So then we have a characters social emotional learning policy that's R4. That one, when I was looking at the policy, the way that it was written, there were a lot of indicators within it. It looked like two policies written into one. One was just character and one was social emotional. I was just wondering if that one could somehow be tied into that goal 1 of the strategic plan, safety and belonging, where we take climate and culture data for students, staff, and families and collectively put that into one piece. I noticed that a lot of the policy for that was written more of creating upstanding citizens. And I was just trying to think of how we would say yes or no to that, versus trying to, I guess, even edit our surveys to ask the questions that we want to know information for students and staff and families, so that whatever we decide for our policy, we're asking the right questions of everybody else, that we're getting the data that we need. And then academic achievement, right now we have kind of like 9 sub policies for all the subjects, and somehow trying to split that into 2 reports. And this is just my thinking and mine and Christy's. But how can we get the state assessment data into one? So like the core subjects, and then how do we get all of the other academic subjects reported on in another? And then R3 was civic engagement. To me, that could also possibly be lumped into safety and belonging. So then we would have maybe 4 or 5 results policies. And then on operational expectations, try to combine OE 11, 12, and 9, which were facilities, safety, and learning environment, with the idea of like they're all talking about physical space. Instructional program could stay. I was wondering if financial planning, administration, asset protection, if we'd still want those as 3 separate reports, or somehow combine those if needed to be 2 reports instead of 3. And then just wording wise, I was looking at University Place. They had a report that was communication with the board and then communication with the public. And we have a communication with the board, and we have relationship with and engagement of community stakeholders. And so I didn't know if those could be worded slightly differently. And then OE1 and OE2, I think, could be combined. Those are global operational expectations and emergency superintendent succession. I think those could be combined into expectations of the superintendent. So those were some ideas.
Thank you. Doing our
So
work
if-
for us.
If I may comment, it makes total sense to take a common sense approach to this situation. And there's no denial that we have a lot of overlap in a lot of these policies. And for those that are providing the data that we, have requested, I would suggest we give some leeway to using a common sense approach as you've done, and give you some flexibility to combine these monitoring reports, and maybe put it together and we'll address it at a later time and take a look at how that rolls out. But at this time, I endorse what you're doing, and I'm behind you taking this common sense approach and combining these policies.
I know that, Steve and I, well, from kind of the beginning, we're thinking that the monitoring reports were a little cumbersome and redundant. Like, you said, there's this overlap. And honestly, I would be in favor of a dashboard that had nothing but data and leave out all the words, where you could just go and you could look at attendance, for example, or you could look at the graduation rate, or you could look at, test scores and say, okay, I can see, that they're improving or they're not, or whatever, without having an interpretation, a verbal spin put on it. Just, you get the data, you think about it, and then you have the discussion. And, the superintendent can describe the things that, influence, like say test scores or whatever, but I just, I always kind of would prefer just to have the raw data and make up my own mind whether I think, that shows an improvement or not, as being told, yeah, this is, I didn't really word that very well, but
I hear what you mean.
It's like, it's
And
better.
I think that works for your brain. But I
Yeah.
think we have to remember the monitoring reports are really for the community. While you use them, they really are for the person who says, how's Ferndale doing? And as a teacher, I always thought about, the data, the state assessment data, while we use it for district teachers, that's not what teachers use, right?
Yeah.
And there's so many data sets that explain who our kids are. And so the narrative part helps us to connect dots, to say, okay, so here's a subgroup. How are they doing on the state assessment? But then how are they doing on the iReady? And the state data is a snapshot of moment in time. It's how that child performed on that day. I talk about WAKIDS data all the time. We talk about it in legislation as it's K-ready, and you know how I feel about that term. But no, it's not. It's data that says who's had access, who hasn't had access, who's had opportunity, who hasn't had opportunity. And so what are we doing? We're using that data to increase opportunities and access to kids earlier. And what are we seeing happening? Our data is going up. It doesn't mean they're any more ready. The children are ready, but it's hard to judge a child who has never played with another child on their social emotional because they've never gotten to practice it, versus a child who is practicing it every day, all day, and they're learning how to practice it in museums, and they're learning to practice it on the ferry and on the plane. I think about Nancy got to come today to morning gathering. I don't have any data to show what happens there, but if you want to talk about community and belonging and social emotional learning, we want to tell that story because it's pretty amazing. And then she got to listen. I'm going to steal your story, but she got to listen to two of our students day after who had gotten to go to China. And one student sharing about how she went to China. It was the first time she had been in an airport. Her first flight was to China. And now she's going to Hawaii. And they got to go to school every day with students there. I don't have a state assessment. That's not going to show up on the dashboard. And what they were sharing about what they learned is way more than we're ever offering them at Ferndale High School. So I think that's why we do the narrative, Peggy. And the dashboard, I wish it did have everything, but it's kind of like these meetings. We can't talk about everything. It can't hold everything. So we do interviews, we do surveys, we meet with kids, we listen, we watch. And so there's a lot of data besides. There's the quantitative data, and then really there's also the qualitative.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I think to me, it's like the quick little thing is like, okay, is our attendance increasing? In other words, if we've been following this plan to increase attendance, is it actually working? So you can just see if the numbers are going up or down, so you know whether it's time to, some of that stuff is just so,
Yes, some of that. And in fact,
and that's what
we are actually doing that data and sending it out to families now once a month, where every school Bobby's tracking every school's data but then we're tracking the attendance for the whole district. Then we're creating a toolbox for every school. So every principal's putting in, these are all the things I do to increase attendance. So then if I'm the principal of Custer and I look at Cascadia, I can say, oh, we haven't tried that. We'll try that. So by the end of this year, we'll have a full toolbox of all the strategies. We're going to have week by week attendance data, by school, week by week attendance data. So you're going to have plenty of attendance data, but that's going out to communities. That's going to parents. So they can see it. And just one school is doing that. And yesterday, they shared with me the first week they had one class that had over 95% of their students attend. So that was just one class, right? And then week 2, because they announced it on the overhead or the loudspeaker, so-and-so's class had 95% of attendance. So then the next week kids are like, I want to do that. So the next week it was 5 classes. The next week it was 9 classes. So we're sharing the data back with kids too.
I saw evidence of that at Horizon Middle School's parent family night the other night. The principal talked about attendance, and then just walking around the school, I saw that there was a whiteboard saying the percentage for that day. It looks like it's updated every single day. So the emphasis is out there.
Well, and the one thing I like with those reports is, like you said, those pieces that don't show up. And the original envisionment of those reports was, and we've gotten to it to some degree, is having those links where you can go to those other pieces so that the person who wants to dive in and dig deeper, and read, more than the basics can do that. Because it is neat to share those things that don't show up in a dashboard or to put the reality into this tool.
So because we also want to honor time, and we could sit here and talk about this. This guy's thinking about this all the time right now, because I told him, think about this. What we could do is we could put those together so you can actually see what it could look like. And we can make some recommendations. This is why these are all the same, so you can see what you're adding, what you're losing. I think that's important. A little bit of a model like the policies, maybe we can figure that out. We could make some recommendations to you and present a package of what you could be looking at. From there, start to work with the wording. It would be very general, very basic. And then through that, our hope is a conversation to say, well, this really matters to us. I think kind of what we do with facilities. Like we want a preventative maintenance cycle. Okay, so that's going to be an indicator. We're going to put that down. So we'd love to hear that. So that's one thing we can do on the back end to present to you. Then you have something to look at. Otherwise, you're going to be going through all of these, trying to figure out. You're going to do what he's been doing.
Yeah, Bobby's the expert on this, so it sounds like he's thought this through. So I would go with what Steve said, and you're recommending that you get to do all that work.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's all about delegation. Judging by some of the reports you've given us, yes, it is your nerd place to go. And I say that with all great, respect and admiration. I think giving us that, because the one thing when some of this stuff was written and put together, having somebody who had a feel for it really helped facilitate it. If we had sat there trying to do it ourselves, it would have been very difficult.
And I always look at those monitoring reports and I think, I'm sure glad I don't have to write these things. And Christy, I hope that by tweaking this takes some of the load off for those things, because honestly, I feel like you got more important things to do than impress us with a monitoring report. But at the same time, obviously we need the information, but still, I mean,
I actually would love to share about how that's evolved since I first got here. What were those reports? They used to be like 30 pages. And Jackson really does a lot of the writing. And now Bobby is actually the point of contact. So what happens is he and I meet and we talk about the monitoring report and we identify all the people who should be involved in this report. Then he sends out a Google doc, a form. And so like the communication report, if you look at how many different types of communication there were in, he sends that to Holly and Mark. Here are all the financial things. Can you please give us examples and the data that you think about when this happens? So about 6 people filled that in. Then he takes all that data and he presents it to Jackson and they sit down and plan. Bobby changed the format so it's more reader friendly. And then they begin writing. Then once they write it, then what they do is they send that to Chris and I read it. And then I start to make edits and revisions. So a lot of work goes into it, but there's a lot of people working on them. And we need to know, right? If we're not writing those reports, we're not evaluating how we're doing. So I actually really like it. And then I'll say, oh, here's 5 things to add. Chris will always say, here's something to add, or this doesn't make sense. And so it's a very detailed process. And it takes about a month to write every report. But that's our accountability. You know, if we didn't have to, and like I said, that district called me and said, how do you do this? Because we're having to spend time. We talk about an executive team. He meets with, teaching and learning right now about this report. And then we're going to share that report with more than just you. That goes to every principal. We're going to monitor it in January. Chris, when is the state of the district? In January, we're going to host a state of the district where we're going to invite community members. You'll be invited. We'll get that date on the SMORE, where it's students, it's us, where we're going to say, this is how the district's doing, good and bad. This is where we're at, and be really just forthright with families about how things are going. So we're going to give that a shot, some accountability publicly, but beyond board meetings. So we are using it. I actually really like the reports, but we just have too many.
So what will the format be like for State of the District? Will it be like an invitation, almost town hall type thing?
Yeah, kind of. And then we will, it'll be in the PAC at the high school. And I'll be presenting, but we'll also have students presenting. We'll probably have some opportunities to see things like morning gathering, which the community couldn't see that at another time. It might be highlighting some of our programs, unless you get to go into schools or your students are taking something, you don't necessarily see what that looks like. We may highlight new programs such as Latinos in Action. What does that look like? And so we have to decide, what is it our community is curious about? And then we'll start to go from there. But it really is an opportunity to say, this is what we want. And then the real hope is after we present, we'll send out a survey. We'll share the strategic plan, and this is where we're at, and this is where we need to go. A survey to ask families, what are those things that resonated with you tonight versus some things that hopes and dreams you have for the organization. So we're going to give it a shot.
So do you have enough input then to move forward? Cool. So then the other thing that was on the agenda is, I'm sort of going backwards because I forgot about it, is there was a question, or they were also looking for some input, or we were looking for having some discussion as far as, are there other types of meetings that we would like to have? Peggy alluded to as far as having and scheduling another meeting each month, so that we have a time for having some of this discussion and such. That's one possibility, and doesn't necessarily mean, none of these preclude the others. But then there are, school linkages, there are community linkages. Are there types of things that we would like Christy and her team to be working, setting up for us as far as, where we get together with a certain group to be looking at. Examples that I've heard about are ones where getting together with like the PTO groups to hear what they have to say. Yes, and sometimes it's a structured thing where we have certain questions and then there are open discussion times. We've done it in the past when we were looking for information on different programs and what people were thinking about it. We did it with some of the before the high school is built, getting people's input as different things that way. Called them gold mining events, where we invited in various community members and had different roundtable discussions around the room and had people move at different times. So lots of different formats. And so the other thing that's been suggested is having some students. What is your experience like? What could be done better? So just wanted to kind of throw those things out as far as if there were, do people want to do school visits? Challenge with school visits is those happen during the day. Not all of us are retired. Must be nice. But in that regard, so sometimes that's a little bit harder. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, well, if we can't all five do it, we can't do it. Sometimes it's we get who we get. But there's definitely a difference to being on site as opposed to having the group come here and make a presentation. Thoughts, again, this is kind of a brainstorming input meeting to help give some direction as we do planning.
So I do have some questions because in looking back, through old meetings from before my time, noticed that it appeared that meetings were, and maybe I'm wrong about this, meetings were held at individual schools, like say at Horizon, and there would be talk of the school improvement plan and how they were coming along in that. And, that's that, would be a special meeting, I suppose, because, it wouldn't be the usual time and place. But, just to do one, well, of course, that's a lot of schools, but, and, to make that part of it. And would we actually want to hear about the individual schools improvement plans? That's because that's not really our area. That's an administrative thing. And, is that something that you used to do that and you were doing that even under coherent governance? So I just want to hear more about what you used to do. Sure. And what benefit it provided.
We used to do we would have, and I think if I remember right, we did it on a rotating basis. So we would like catch all the schools in 2 years. And some we did as visits, on-site visits. Others we did at the board meetings. And with the school improvement programs, unfortunately, I didn't feel like those meetings were as valuable as when we actually heard more along what the schools were doing. Unfortunately, the school improvement plans all seemed to have kind of the same theme, and it was like you saw one, you saw them all, and I don't mean to be offensive with that, but it was just they had all kind of the same thing, and so it didn't seem like that was of value. But when we went and we did a school visit and heard about a specific program or some of the things that they were doing that they felt were moving the needle at their school or were helping out at their school, that was much more of benefit. I look at case in point of there's a few of us that have went to Skyline to see what Pat Rogley and them were doing with their program, just to see, okay, how's that work and how it was working. And that gave a much deeper impression or understanding of it than as great as they could tell about it. So I think from my perspective and from what I've had as experience, I think going and seeing some of those individual programs or letting the schools kind of highlight and showcase what they're doing that seems to be working with their student population, and just interacting, seeing the kids in their classrooms and seeing what they're doing, I think was more benefit than hearing about the school improvement program.
I was just going to add, they're called a linkage. And so it allows you to go in and get a inside look into the day. It's often students who lead it. Some linkages can be where you sit in a room like this and there's a presentation. Some can be, here's a menu, here's some student leaders. They're going to take you around and showcase what's happening. It gives you a chance to ask them questions, ask teachers questions, see in real time some of the work. A linkage could also be if there's a population of students or families you would like to get to know. Those can happen in the evening time where we say, you know what, we're going to invite a group of family who this is something they all have in common. Perhaps it's all our multilingual families. And we would bring interpreters in, and I would have Nancy sitting at a table with some. I would have Peggy, you sitting at a table with some. Steve would sit at a table with some. Kevin would sit at a table with some, and then I'd have one staff member at each table. And you would just get to ask some questions, and they would just get to have a conversation with you. And then you would share out. Nancy would say, well, these are the things I heard. Peggy would say, these are the things I heard. Steve, the things I heard. Kevin, the things I heard. And the next meeting, you could say, you know, what are we going to do about that? These are some things we heard that are going really well. These are some things that we're not doing really well in, and we need to make some changes. So you have two options. Those linkages really can happen outside when it's more accessible to families who work to come. And like I said, a linkage at a school, I wouldn't do all the schools. So it might be this year, we're going to try to do these 2 schools. Next year, we'll do these 2 schools. And it takes some time, but over time, you get to go see various things. So that's what those can be or could look like.
Yeah, realistically, those linkages are only limited by our imaginations, because I know some have done, with different faith groups within the community, with different groups in the community to get input and direction that way too. So, so lots of different possibilities and things I've heard of. And certainly the schools appreciate it. They like to see our bright, shiny faces there.
Nancy and I both attended, although we split up. We didn't stay together. We both went to the Horizon open house thing. And so information that you get from that, what's the best way to just email you and say, hey, this is something I noticed while I was there. And
I think there's that, and currently then also during board sharing time.
Okay. I know this is off topic, but I want to know how the phone, you said that it was good not to have the phones locked up. How did that go today I'd like to hear.
Yeah, I was really tracking that data off of Ferndale neighbors. So the one worry I had about phones getting locked up, right? If you use a magnet to lock them up, then you have to have a magnet to unlock them. So the students have been so amazing about keeping them in their backpack or sometimes just keeping in their pocket so they know that it just can't come out during instructional time. It was interesting today before everything happened. I was walking through the school before school when they could have their phones. There were very few phones out. I think I counted less than 5. And so that was amazing, right? Because kids are connecting. They were talking, laughing. And then during the event, they had their phones with them. If they grabbed their backpack, their phone was with them. So they were texting their families. If a student didn't bring their backpack, then they might not have had it. But that would be the case any day of the week. What I appreciated was in a time that was stressful and they were not necessarily fully feeling safe, they could get to their phone without having to need an adult to unlock it. So I appreciate the fact how we've approached it and treating them like the young people who can be responsible with property. And they were amazing. Our students today were amazing. They were calm. They were respectful. They were listening. They were engaging. I think I shared with you earlier, we just, when we decided that we had to call school for the day, we let the walkers go first. And then those students who had their keys got to, they were the next wave. And then everyone else, every parent pickup, and every bus rider went up to their home middle school. And their parents picked them up there, or they had their bus and rode there from there. And so, was it perfect? No, but it was smooth. Like I said earlier, we called every bus driver in early to work. I mean, they work at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. So to call them in the middle of the day and say, hey, we need you to come, they all showed up. So yeah, it went great. But that was helpful that the students could get to their phone when they needed them. And so I think kudos to you that we didn't go the route of the lockdown. Because in a situation like today, they were still able to do what they needed to do with their phone. And I do know that brought some peace to parents.
I think that kudos to the whole staff, and it was great, but also kudos to the students, because they have allowed us to keep this going, and they are actually doing a really good job in respecting it. I have to say I feel guilty, and I'm going to repent, because I went to the play thing, what they do, like, what is it that they did recently at the high school, that they did a play, and geez, my daughter,
Homecoming,
it was a
What
homecoming skit,
homecoming
right?
skit.
All the kids, I didn't see one phone from all the students, and I was the only one recording my daughter and my son. And then I realized what I did, because and I'm repenting, and I'm saying I'm sorry, but kudos to those young responsible people that are allowing us to do it in a way that we have this issue. And then I was able to get a hold of my kids and know where they were. So I just wanted to say that.
It really sounds like we have impacted culture, which is great, and in a positive light. I mean, I love hearing that the kids are interacting with each other more so.
If I could take us back to the meetings schedule, there are two pieces that I don't want to forget because they happen. They're going to be here before we know them. And I don't know, I'm looking at the time. I don't know that tonight's the night, but perhaps it's something that because we talked about having some time set aside at WASDA where we talk about some things. So I can present to you at WASDA your packet for you to review. So then maybe the meeting after WASDA, you guys can start having a conversation around the monitoring reports. That would be my recommendation. We have the joint meeting with Lummi Nation that we are working to schedule for November this year. Luckily we don't have an election. We don't have to worry about anything of that. Last year we went out there, so I don't know if we're trying to see, they're having a little bit of change in leadership. So, and we canceled our meeting with them today, but I think we're scheduled to host it here. Typically it happens 1 hour prior to the board meeting. So we'll need to figure that out, and we'll get that information to you. The other part is it's December, because it's not an election year, where you do the change, what's it called? Change of roles or reorganization meeting. And so I think it's important, just given how that went last year, that you spend some time talking about making sure up front how we're going to vote, what that's going to look like. We're going to use this model. The policy says it happens after the approval of the minutes. Last year, the minutes were in the consent agenda. You've since moved them to the top. So I think you need to look at that and just have that conversation up front in November prior to the December meeting, so everybody knows what that's going to look like and can anticipate that. If that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, Christy and I talked about that and thought it would be best to make it smoother that we do that, have that conversation so we all are on the same page with it. So. Okay.
Can we talk more about school linkages, and can we can we talk about maybe doing some of those? And you could do those we should do it as a board, like everybody who could potentially make it to something like that. I really like that idea of getting together one board member per table of whatever group that is, whether it's multi-language learners or any other group. I like that idea of just getting input from parents and families about how things are going positively and negatively for them. So we could just have more input from the community about how to make everybody thrive.
Mhm. So there's two ways you can go about it. You can spend that time talking about it now. You could think about what kinds of linkages, like if it's a parent night, what would you like? Who would you like to hear from? Is it just random? Is there a certain subgroup of families you want to hear from? So you could talk about that. In terms of a school visit, Chris and I could look at a schedule and make a couple of options for you to then kind of what we did with tonight. Here are some options. Do you vote on which one, or not vote because you cannot vote outside, but here would be my preferences. And then we'd bring that data to you to look at what people said. I'm just trying to think about the best way to do it that's efficient for you.
Does anybody else? How do you feel about those sorts of things? Just getting feedback from thoughts about that.
Definitely, I will speak from my always historic stance. Going and doing the school visits has always been a positive. We have, and we've done some of the linkages as well as I was talking about them. The school visits are great, going around and just sometimes letting them highlight what's working in their schools, or have done ones where we've done school improvement plans, which admittedly are kind of boring, and I don't know that they're really that beneficial. The ones that have been much more impressive have been where the school has highlighted programs that they're doing or what's going on in their school. And some of those things are universal across the board, but it gives us this chance to see, okay, how's technology being used? How are, the facilities being used? What in the facilities looks like it needs improvement, or what is, it helps us to put reality into what's happening. Those linkages that happen as far as with groups from the community, and it can be various, you name it, it can be of getting input from people or hearing their input or how they perceive the schools, and what, like you say, what can we do to improve? So I think there's benefits to both options. It's just a matter of figuring out the time. And if we're doing linkages with the community, probably more critical that we have all of us, or the majority of us, whereas if we're doing a school visit where there's during the day, that
Individual.
yeah, that can be individual or the group or whoever can make it. But I that was certainly one of the things that we missed when COVID hit, because that's when they sort of went by the wayside. It was hard to do school visits when everybody was schooling at home. Do you, Chrissy, from your standpoint, do you think, are there any groups that you think that we would get more benefit from as far as meeting with? Not that all wouldn't be valuable, but as far as gaining a perspective. I mean, I don't know if I'm asking the question right, but
well, yeah, actually, thank you for letting me ask this. Because when I was doing some tutoring at this was years ago, okay, for a student at Vista Middle School, I got an opportunity to see some of the interactions that I was kind of concerned about, specifically around students with IEPs who didn't feel like their IEPs were being followed to the letter. And, just some things that it's like, how do you address this? So I think people who have kids who have special needs, like really kind of feel a lot of times like they're overlooked, like they're kind of been shoved to the background. And that's one group that I think we really could do, at least I don't know how much things have changed since I was there, but certainly at the time that I was there, I was hearing these complaints that, like, they're supposed to be putting my kid, because he has a hearing problem, they're supposed to be setting him front and center so he can see the teacher's lips move. But instead they keep putting him in the back row and next to a kid that makes spontaneous noises. And so he gets frustrated and he lashes out because he can't learn. And so, but it was a repeated problem that this happened. And so you hear stories like that. And you're like, okay, where's the breakdown? What's going wrong that's causing this to happen? And is there some minor tweak that be made to, make things work better for students in that situation? So, yeah, I would kind of like to meet with those kinds of people.
And piggybacking off on that spurred a brain cell. I remember, and you were there too, when we did the high school open house last year. And we had asked some people, and we had a couple of people, parents with kids with IEPs, and one was like, rah, rah, you guys are doing great. And the other was like, well, we're not getting, so yeah, I had forgotten about that, but that refreshed my memory about it. And that, would be a group that is not typically as well, necessarily represented. So
Yeah, it could be students who have accommodations through a 504 or specialized instruction with an IEP, both. So we could, I can work with Trina and the team on that and see about some families. I think it's especially given good feedback for us with our focus on more inclusionary practices where kids, we have the program, for example, at Skyline. What has that done for students who aren't having to necessarily spend as much time in programs and increased time? So I think students and staff, I think that could be a good one, and their parents. The other part too, I wonder about doing a linkage at the high school, given the students now have been in there a full year and hearing about the difference about their learning. What are some of the choices that they're taking? That might be a good place to start. What are their plans post-secondary? I think there's some things that they could offer up at a high school level too. And so anyway, those would be a couple ideas.
One thing just to throw out while I'm thinking about it so I don't forget about it. If we do a linkage with parents, kids that have individual learning plans, can we get a summary or something to help us so that when you talk about the 504 or these things that I have no clue what you're talking about?
Yes, I can provide a vocabulary lesson up front. That'd be
Thank
great.
you. Otherwise, I'll start talking medical terms.
Yeah.
Then we can
And it'll be good for them to be able to say, my child has an IEP or my child has a 504. This is how it works. But yeah, I think there's they both are legally binding, but different.
So I don't know if this is a good place to bring this up or not, but after the thing with Horizon, going to the open house at Horizon, and talking to the people who were in orchestra and band, and they indicated that because I asked, how many kids do you have? And they're like, well, the enrollment is way down because they don't have the block scheduling. They don't have the alternate day stuff. And so they both indicated some sadness over that, both of the teachers and then the one guy I didn't get to talk too much at all, the guy who was teaching art, English, and what was the other thing? Choir, thank you. Yes. Yeah. So
middle school is a very complicated schedule. It's very nuanced. It is hard. And there's a lot more to numbers besides just that. So we're working on rebuilding those programs. So, but it is complicated.
Can I ask a question? Do you like try and track attendance? I mean, because I'm thinking, okay, so the claim is that by having these these electives, that kids are more likely to turn up for school and whatnot. When you have a dip like this because of, circumstances, can you line the attendance numbers up and show that there is at least a correlation?
Sometimes you can, sometimes it's in the increase. So I'm thinking of a class, it's not a middle school, it's a high school class that was an elective class where the content was amazing, the teacher's amazing, the just high level of engagement. There's a club that's tied to it after school, and we had close to 60 kids wanting to take the class. So it's a formula for high success. So those are the kinds of things we look at and track and watch. The back of our shirts that say you belong, when you teach to the heart, the mind will follow. Relationships is the number one variable. It can take a really complicated subject or a really fun subject, and they bring it to life. So the electives do. They are things that it makes me sad. That's oftentimes things that kids don't get the opportunity to do. It's why this board implemented an 8-period day. So students were not bound to just take content areas. They had opportunities to take some of the other things. And that's why we hold that, because that's sometimes the fun part, right? That they want to do the arts and the sciences. I mean, look at our theater program. That is one that kids feel a purpose. They're part of a community. Those students are taking choir, they're taking, music classes, they're taking art classes. And so, yeah. So that's why I think it'd be good to hear from the students. What are those classes? There's a reason we have close to 70 CTE classes. And regardless of the student, regardless of their ability, their race, socioeconomic status, there's no difference in our CTE coursework. It is equitable because it's just every student can enter. So, yeah. I mean, who doesn't love kindergarten? There's a reason kids love kindergarten, right? Because it's play-based. CTE, art, music, those are ways of kids getting to play at the age and stage that's appropriate for them.
I will argue that I hated kindergarten because they made us take a nap and I didn't have to do that at home.
I didn't take a nap either, Peggy.
Well, and you think about it, we're often known for our theater program, our band, our football team. I don't hear anybody talking about, no offense intended, about our English class or our, history
They're
class.
starting to.
I know.
They are starting to. They're starting to think about different ways. And you think about, Gabby, who sits over here, her talking about DECA. I mean, she loves DECA. So, I mean, our teachers in Ferndale are phenomenal. I go in and I'm just like, really? Are you kidding me? And video design and things I would have never dreamed of taking in school. And so what we are working on now at the middle schools is how do we use CTE as a pathway? That hasn't been a pathway. And so now that's becoming a pathway.
Had an opportunity to see Mrs. McGreevy's science class where they were building the bridges and the turbines and, and then I guess they move on to robotics, and that had that been there when my boys were there, well, actually my daughter, I would have given anything for that. That really was really great.
I've been in education a long time, and we should be incredibly proud by what our students have access to, because we have staff who truly are bringing learning to life. It's pretty phenomenal. Can I reiterate that I think what our plan is? Bobby and I are going to work on the monitoring reports. We are going to put a package together of what he described tonight in a way that we will present to you of how to streamline them, what makes more sense. And I will bring those to WASDA. Okay. Then we will, my dad is calling me. I'm sure my dad watched the news tonight. I probably should have called my dad earlier. Anyway, see, doesn't matter how old you are. Yeah, I know. I was like, oh, I forgot. I did not call my parents. I'll call them afterwards. Yeah. Oh gosh. I know. I'm just like, oh, yeah, it might be. But I told my children. So then I'm going to make some recommendations on linkages. I'm going to take what you said. I'm going to give a couple of options. Chris is magic with a calendar, so we'll look at that. And then I'm going to map out some things for us to recommend for us to talk about at WASDA, which I will present publicly at the next board meeting so people know, because we cannot videotape WASDA. We don't have that ability. So people will know what you're working on at WASDA during a 2-hour block. We'll find either a room or somewhere to go and do that. Does that sound right? Okay, Chris, how did I do in summarizing? Okay. But I do. I need ChatGPT.
So I think that anything else that we need to discuss or talk about? Because if not, I'll go ahead. Oh,
Yep, sorry.
that's okay.
Can we continue to look at, like, say, Arlington's, the way they've put things together, and for clarifying language, and maybe, making sure that we spell out what our expectations are for things that are brought to us.
Yeah, I'll talk to, or we can talk to Chris and Christy, show them that and see what their thoughts are as far as, is that information doable? And then we can talk with the rest of the board too. Again, I don't want to throw it out at them because they probably don't know what we're talking about. But that agenda, I really did like the information that they had on there, and they're using board docs. So
Well, and then they're taking everything they do and they're linking it back to one of their goals. They have a link, you click on it, it takes you back to what the goal is. And I think I really like that part.
yeah, and that is, some of the stuff that we had talked about and intended with coherent governance just never got there. So that was cool to look at. I need to look at it more. Okay. Yeah, Arlington Public Schools. I will not get excited about their website. Trying to find the board docs on there was a bit of a challenge. I finally did find it. Yeah, it's down under administration, under school board, under board docs. So if you want to take a look at it, but basically what they had with their agenda is it linked reasons for the timing, budget implications, and just had a lot of information there that really helped, I think, with transparency. Yeah. Okay. So, not seeing anybody else reaching for their mic button, I will go ahead and declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, thank you, Chris.